Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the Middle East Institute for inviting me. What I'll try to do in the next 10-15 minutes is to give you an overview of Turkey's Middle East policy and in what ways we should try to analyze this shifting dynamic in the region. So let me start with basically perhaps the domestic dynamics in Turkey and try to talk about some of the drivers of Turkey's new activist engagement-oriented foreign policy. The big question, of course, in Washington and in Western capitals is whether this is an Islamization of Turkey, because there's a certain preconceived notion of Turkey as a staunch ally of the United States, a country that had, during the Cold War, an almost exclusively pro-Western attitude, which did not really look to the Middle East as an area where Turkish leverage, Turkish power, Turkish economic relations really mattered. Well, I think in many ways, instead of seeing this through the lenses of Islamization, I would submit to you that this is rather a normalization of Turkish identity, Turkish state-society relations, in many ways also a certain level of democratization. Public opinion began to matter more in the last 10 years in Turkey. I think that's a product of democratization. Turkey overall, despite the fact that it's not really a liberal democracy yet in the European standards, is becoming a more democratic country where public opinion really matters. And that means that overall, the elite-oriented structure of Turkish foreign policy and the military-oriented structure of the Turkish foreign policy is changing. And now public opinion and a new elite, a different kind of elite, not the Kemalist elite, but a more conservative elite, the rise of the Anatolian elite, is also a major driver of this change in Turkey. Is it Islamization? In many ways, it is more of a conservative Turkey that is emerging, a more nationalist Turkey. I would say a more independent actor. And I would underline this concept of independence. I think both the Turkish military and the current government in Turkey, the AKP, agree that Turkey should be more of an independent actor, that it should not really pursue a foreign policy that is exclusively pro-West, oriented towards the transatlantic organization, transatlantic dynamics, or towards the East, but it should basically pursue its own national and economic interests. And that brings me to the second driver of Turkish foreign policy towards the Middle East. It's simply the economy. The fact that when you look at the trade figures, Turkey's commerce trade with the Middle East has quadrupled in the last 10 years. So you have basically more and more Turkish businessmen, more and more Turkish private sector companies, construction companies active in the Arab world, in the Middle East. And this is also something that is very different in the post-Cold War dynamic. During the Cold War, the Middle East was not really open to Turkish markets, and the Turkish businessmen really did not look at the Middle East as a market. But this is increasingly changing, and there's a diversification of Turkey's export markets. Russia, Central Asia, Middle East are part of these shifting dynamics of the Turkish export orientation. And although Europe is still the main market, there are more and more trade with the Middle East, and this is, I think, a driver, a kind of mercantilistic driver, if you will, of Turkey's approach to the Middle East. There is also, of course, the fact that Turkey is coming to terms with its Muslim identity. The government in power comes from an Islamic pedigree. Some people argue that it is still a pro-Islamic government. And in many ways, there is a sense of solidarity with the Middle East. There's a sense of solidarity with the Arab world. It is not really a vision that is present in the Kemalist circles, which tends to look at the Arab world as an area which is backward and that doesn't really matter for Turkey's strategic interest. To the contrary, I think the current government and its grand vision, especially the one of Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, believes that during the Cold War, Turkey's obsession with Westernization and belonging to Western clubs came at the expense of Turkey's Muslim identity, Turkey's strategic depth, potentially with the Middle East, with Central Asia, with Africa. So you have this kind of more 360-degree foreign policy emerging in Turkey. Those are some of the positive drivers. I would say that starting with the end of the Cold War, the Kurdish problem was a more negative driver of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East. If you focus in the 1990s, and if you look at the way the Turkish foreign policy in the 1990s towards the Middle East was shaped, it was almost exclusively focused on the Kurdish question. So and this is at the heart of why Turkey, in fact, decided not to support the US invasion of Iraq, because the Turkish security establishment, the Turkish political establishment, and definitely Turkish parliamentarians had a simple question to ask for American policymakers. And the question was, what is your vision of Iraq once Saddam is gone? Especially, what is your vision of northern Iraq, the Kurds, once Saddam is gone? And once they realized that the answer was not clear, that there was a vague answer along the lines of Iraq will become democratic and basically there will be power sharing mechanisms and people will find a way, the Turkish emphasis on status quo and the Turkish emphasis on stability in Iraq kicked in, and there emerged a major debate about whether the Kurds would achieve independence in a post-Saddam Iraq. So this Kurdish question, I think, dominated to a great part the 1990s, but also an early part of the 21st century's first decade, from 2003 to 2006. Turkey's approach to the Kurdish question was exclusively security-oriented. What happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that Turkey decided to change its policy towards the Kurdish question, and that also helped change Turkey's image in the Arab world. Because I think in the Arab world, there was a number of preconceived notions of Turkey. First, that Turkey would never say no to the United States, that it was basically a lackey of the United States, and whatever the United States would ask, Turkey would do. The fact that Turkey voted against the invasion of Iraq and against the participation of basically Turkish troops and to allow US troops to pass through Turkey was a big surprise, not only in the Arab world, but also in the West. But in a way, it conflicted with this image of a pro-US Turkey that would always be pliant to US demands. Then the image of Turkey as the anti-Kurdish country, Turkey as the country that would always suppress the Kurds, began to change in the last 4 or 5 years. How? With basically this approach to the domestic dimension and the foreign policy dimension of the Kurdish question. Turkey simply decided that in the last 4 years, I believe, that it would be better to co-opt northern Iraqi Kurds rather than confront them, to in a way play big brother to them, to tell them that they can coexist with Turkey as long as they don't provide safe havens for the PKK, the Kurdish rebel organization. And in that sense, a new modus vivendi, a new partnership emerged between Erbil and Ankara. And Turkey began engaging not only former rivals like Syria, but also northern Iraq on the question of the Kurds. And that brought a new soft power dimension to Turkey's perception in the Middle East that was usually more along the lines of hard power and Turkish military and repressive attitudes towards the Kurds. So that also is an important factor, the way that Turkey, the possibility for Turkey to transcend the Kurdish problem, to find ways to deal with the cultural, political dimension of the problem at home with democratization, and the ability to deal with the foreign policy dimension of this with northern Iraq by engaging northern Iraq instead of confronting it, by accepting that there is a Kurdish federation and coming to terms with the Kurdish reality, also I think is an important shifting dynamic in Turkey's approach to the Middle East.